Hi there, and welcome to the Bloody Scotland Book Club, the November Book Club. And it's very dark outside, and as far as I'm concerned, the snow's on its way. So, as James Crawford said last month, it's the time of year when we escape with a good book. Tonight we have a wonderful selection of books for you. And we're going to start off with one set in Edinburgh, featuring Inspector Tony McLean. How do you write a detective novel set in Rebus land? Maybe you combine crime and the supernatural and set a long-running series on its way to great acclaim. Next up, Glasgow, a debut from 20 years ago, still resonating today. A dissolute auctioneer named Rilke takes us on a journey into Glasgow, the Glasgow underworld few had seen or imagined. And third up, we move to Dakota, USA, to a Lakota reservation where Virgil Wounded Horse enforces the law, where the tribal council and the Federal Bureau of Investigation fails to tread. And now to our panel for this evening, you'll see in your screens, who are all too modest to tell us all about their achievements. I sent them an email and I got a very brief replies, and here they are. First up, Louise Fairburne is a freelance journalist and former crime fiction reviewer for the Scotsman newspaper. She's chaired events at various crime fiction festivals and was a judge for this year's New Zealand's Niall Marsh Awards. Next up, Jane Hamilton. When I asked her to send, this is what she claims to be, a granny. Well, I can totally go with that, as I am. A crime reporter, I know, because I read all that stuff that pops up, and I'm allowed to say the Daily Record, I don't know. And a bookworm, which is the most important, I think. As she says, her whole life in one sentence. Third, Craig Sisterton. I know Craig, or first met Craig at I think it was the very first Bloody Scotland in Stirling. And fortunately, he was back with us this year. I got the biggest hug that I've ever had in my life when he appeared. Craig is a past judge of the McIlvanney Prize and author of Southern Cross Crime, a reader's guide to Australian and New Zealand crime writing. And I know he is also involved in the Niall Marsh Awards. In fact, I think he might have had something to do with them. So welcome all of our panelists. And let us move to our first book. We're going to begin with Natural Causes by James Oswald. And we have a short clip of James reading from the book.
Hello, my name's James Oswald, and going to read to you a short passage from this, Natural Causes, the first book in the Inspector McLean series. He shouldn't have stopped. It wasn't his case. He wasn't even on duty. But there was something about the blue flashing lights, the scene of crime van and uniforms setting up barriers that Detective Inspector Anthony McLean could never resist. He'd grown up in this neighbourhood, this rich part of town with its detached houses surrounded by large walled gardens. Old money lived here, and old money knew how to protect its own. You were very unlikely to see a vagrant wandering these streets, never mind a serious crime. But now 2 patrol cars blocked the entrance to a substantial house, and a uniformed officer was busy unwrapping blue and white tape. McLean fished out his warrant card as he approached. "What's going on?" "There's been a murder, sir. That's all anyone's told me." The constable tied off the tape and started on another length. McLean looked up the sweeping gravel drive towards the house. A scene of crime van had backed halfway up, its doors wide. A line of uniforms inched their way across the lawn, eyes down in search of clues. It couldn't hurt to have a look, see if there was anything he could do to help. He knew the area, after all. He ducked under the tape and made his way up the drive. Past the battered white van, a sleek black Bentley glinted in the evening light. Alongside it, a rusty old Mondeo lowered the tone. McLean knew the car, knew its owner all too well. Detective Chief Inspector Charles Dogood was not his favourite superior officer. If this was one of his investigations, then the deceased must have been important. That would explain the large number of uniforms drafted in, too. What the fuck are you doing here? McLean turned to the familiar voice. Dogood was considerably older than him, mid-50s at least, his once red hair now thin and greying, his face florid and lined. White paper overalls pulled down to his waist and tied in a knot beneath his sagging gut. He had about him the air of a man who's just nipped out for a fag. I was in the neighbourhood, saw the patrol cars in the lane. And you thought you'd stick your nose in, eh? What are you doing here anyway? I didn't mean to butt in on your investigation, sir. I just thought, well, since I grew up in the area, I might have been able to help. Dogood let out an audible sigh, his shoulders sagging theatrically. Oh well, you're here. Might as well make yourself useful. Go and talk to that pathologist friend of yours. See what wonderful insights he's come up with this time. McLean started towards the front door, but was stopped by Dogood's hand catching him tight around the arm. And make sure you report back to me when you're done. I don't want you sloping off before we've wrapped this up.
That was great, thank you. I'm going to go over to you, Louise, because I know you're a big fan and know a lot about the books, and obviously began at the beginning and have continued. Tell us a bit about your thoughts of what became the opening to what has become a really successful and much loved series of books.
I really enjoyed going back and rereading this. I love the series as a whole, but you forget how it began when you just keep reading the new ones as they come out. It reminds you, it's all so beautifully set up of how McLean, you get his background, you get his personality, you get his Edinburgh, and it's all just carefully slotted into place just where it should be. There's nothing, there's nothing intrusive at all. I can't remember if I started at the beginning or if I started further in, but they're just really well created, well put together, nice, easy reads. If you want something set in Edinburgh and you don't fancy another rebus, well, try this, because it's a different Edinburgh. And it's also very different because it's got this supernatural thread. Now, I know James had trouble getting published at the beginning because publishers would say, but, we can't, how do we market this? Nobody wants supernatural in a crime novel. So he self-published them. And amazingly enough, there is an audience out there for this kind of thing because they're great. And eventually he got picked up with a nice traditional publishing deal, and kind of the rest is history. The thing about the supernatural in here is Tony's a skeptic. Tony's Scully here. He doesn't really believe this is a supernatural thing going on. He just believes this is people doing bad things. That's what it boils down to for him. So we start, not the crime scene that we've just read about. A little bit later, there's another crime scene, and it's the body of a girl from about 50 or 60 years ago. And she's been killed in what is fairly obviously some kind of ritual fashion. But it's not Tony that believes it's this. It's the people who did it believe it. And he kind of bashes against people throughout the book, trying to go, well, it's not. Yeah, okay, they believed it was supernatural, but it's not. It's people. There is a string of murders later on. This is a person or people doing this. This isn't some demon called from wherever. There's a lovely line which I fished out. There we go. This is Tony talking to his superior. Christ knows our job's hard enough as it is without supernatural forces intervening. But just because demons don't exist, it doesn't mean someone can't believe in them enough to kill. And that's Tony all over. He doesn't really believe this stuff, despite what is shown to him, and particularly later in the series. But he knows that these people believe it enough to have done something terrible. but all he's after are these murderers. He's not really interested in the why. He's just interested in the who, and can I put some handcuffs on them and then, you know, throw them in jail. So there's the supernatural element there, but you can take it or not. It's entirely up to the reader in a lot of the books, particularly in this one. You know, there are very human explanations for at least 95% of all the weird stuff that goes on. And God knows Edinburgh, particularly in, let's say, August, has so much weird stuff going on that most people who live here don't bat an eyelid, you know. So you can take it or leave it there. But what it does is create just another, you know, it's just another piece of interest. It's another thread that you can hook onto and enjoy, really. I know that sounds a very odd thing to say about ritual murder, but you can just enjoy all the things that come with it. You can enjoy it when he's introduced to Madame Rose. You can enjoy it later in the series when he gets surrounded by this army of cats who have come to protect him and all these mad things. But you can just, yeah, you can just take it and enjoy it, and that's fine.
Yeah. What about you, Jane? How did you get on with it?
For myself, I thought, you know, there's loads of room for another detective other than Rebus in Edinburgh. Edinburgh, you know, it's a tiny city, but, you know, there's room for more there. And for me, Tony is likable, and it's quite a dark, cold story dealing with some pretty, you know, dark subjects. And then you've got the supernatural, and, you know, I'm a fan of the supernatural anyway, so that, you know, that was a big draw for me in that. But it's quite subtle, it's not in your face, and like Louise says, you know, you can take it or leave it. And I thought, you know, there was a lot going on. You know, we've got all those deaths, we've got the young girl that, you know, 60-year-old cold case, we've got the cat burglar, you know, which is another subplot, another strand. So there's, you know, there's lots going on. And then you've got this key central character who's quite likable. You know, he's got a troubled past, and he's, you know, he's an orphan. And I'm not going to give away any spoilers for anybody that's not read it yet, but, you know, very early on he suffers another horrible episode in, you know, an already tragic life, and there's just a sort of empathy there with him. He's got a difficult relationship with his boss, you know, so you know, and you've got drugs, you've got mental illness, you've got, and is it, you know, is it drugs, is it mental illness, is it evil people, is it, what's going on? You're never quite sure. And, you know, me personally was thinking, oh my goodness, you know, we're going to find some horrible monster at the end of this, but really the monster is human. And so yeah. I'm not going to give out spoilers, but so no, it was great. And I thought Edinburgh is a good backdrop for spooky goings on, because, you know, we've got everything in that city. You know, it's history, it can be moody and it can be menacing just as much as it can be enticing. So no, I thought it was excellent.
Yeah, I should probably say here, when I first read it, which was when it first came out, I knew where he was talking about almost immediately, because I thought it was along the road from our flat in Edinburgh. I thought he was actually in Merchiston. And and then I realised that possibly it was a wee bit further over the hill in the Grange, you know, but the whole area, these sort of offshoots of Morningside Road or Bruntsfield, I've got these big houses, but even lived around the corner there for years, these big houses set back, and J.K. Rowling was there for a while, she moved, but these big houses set back, and, you know, it's as if everything is always quiet and nothing bad happens, which isn't actually true, because when I was, well, I still go back there, although I'm at my home village, there was a murder literally along the road from us in one of those big houses. And I can remember thinking, oh my God, he's sort of foreseen this, you know. The other thing I would just mention, I don't know if everybody remembers when they read it in its first edition, the opening was not that. The opening was the murder of the girl. And I can remember being fairly horrified by that, because I mean, it was very well written, but it was really horrible. And when I reread it again there, I thought it opened with the murder. And then I realized that had been removed. And in fact, it was a very nice piece at the end by James that explained the story of how he'd first written that opening scene. And it had been part of a short story, and it had sort of launched his idea. But then he said, if you want to read it, turn the page now. But if you don't, if you haven't got a strong stomach, don't turn the page, basically. So, of course, I turned the page. So I thought that was really interesting that once it got out in the wide world, that, that opening 500 words or something was taken out. And I actually think it worked, because I think you walked in with him. Yeah. And I thought that was very strong. It was just him. What about you, Craig?
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I've read several books in this series. I also really like James's other crime series as well. But I've read several books in this series, but I believe the first one I read would have been about the fifth or sixth one. So I hadn't actually read it right from the start. And so it was really cool to go back and see how it all began. And I really enjoyed all the books in the series I had read. It's a great, great series. James is really just a masterful, assured storyteller. Louise kind of nailed it. It's just very balanced, like character, plot, setting. It's all very, very good and just comes together very well. There's nothing that kind of overwhelms or any weak spots or anything. It's just a really well-told story where you can kind of stoke into it and go, yep, I'm in the hands of someone who knows what they're doing. And this shows that he was doing that from the very first crime novel he wrote. He had written some other things before, and we've got Stuart McBride to thank for yanking him into the crime fiction world. But yeah, it's just a really masterful crime debut. So assured. I like Louise's point about Tony being kind of Scully, because that's true, that he's the skeptic, but he's very likable. He's had a lot of tragedy in his life, but he's not this tormented detective. He's not this eccentric detective. He's obviously a little bit of a maverick, but he's not like a big maverick detective either. He's almost like an everyman, or kind of in the old comedy terms, he's the straight guy of the comedy duo, kind of thing, more than the kind of crazy out there eccentric one and stuff like that. But it's just really well written, and you just kind of soak into it and go along for the ride. And it's not like a short book at all, but I just found myself tearing through it, and I tore through it in a day and a bit, and it's like it was a 450-page paperback. And like you say, it was a nice note at the end that they did include the original kind of start, and I can see why they made the change, but it was also very good, the original start he had, though slightly more shocking and things like that. And I do like that we walk in the door effectively with Tony right from the start. It's just really fascinating as well, because there's that sense out there among some readers, not all, that crime fiction and mystery is often rational and logical and things like that, and horror is sorry, my neighbour's doing something very loud. Sorry. So I don't know what they're quite not doing there. So I might have to switch my microphone into headphones on, but I'm not sure if that would change it as we go. But yeah, so crime fiction is kind of logical and mystery, and you're working it out. It's all kind of brain and rational. And then that's going to be really annoying. I'm sorry about that for anyone who can hear that. So it's like
it's not. I can barely hear it, so I wouldn't worry. Just talk.
It's like it's decided to power Sanders' house on a Wednesday evening or something like that.
Don't murder him. Don't murder him for it. No.
So, yeah. Well, we know the people to do that, don't we? Apologies for that for everyone.
Yeah. Driven.
So, but yeah, it's really interesting because I was talking to Paul Cleave, who's a very good New Zealand crime writer. He's got a great book out. It's just come out, The Quiet People. He wanted to write horror and then started writing crime. And what he said was that crime was like real horror, that the monsters were real. Where in horror, the monsters are fantastical. But the darker crime, the darker stuff, serial killers, it's like real monsters. And so, but there's a borderlands there. And I think James, along with John Connolly, is excellent at this as well. John Connolly is really excellent at it as well. I think James and John really kind of straddle that borderlines between the fantastical and supernatural, or the logical, because especially this first one, is very much a police procedural with a seasoning of the supernatural.
It is, yeah. I wondered what you thought. We can't ask him directly, but did he know he was going to write a series? What is there a sense from any of you that he wrote this book and, I don't know, really liked the characters, or did he know before he started? We can't ask him, so
I don't know, but I know he'd created the character, well, a version of the character previously. He was writing comic book scripts, trying to get published in things like 2000 AD, not making a lot of headway there. And I think when he was persuaded to write a crime novel, the character kind of came back and morphed into something more, I hate to say standard, but you know, he's a perfectly normal cop with a perfectly normal life. He does like to go home and drink whiskey alone, but he also remembers he actually does get his paperwork done. As Craig said, he's a bit maverick, but not entirely. But I suspect that he probably did write it as the start of a series, because there's so much in here that points to where the series goes that it feels like he must have done. And anybody who gets a publishing deal, the first thing anybody gets asked is this a series? And of course, you just say yes and make it.
Yeah.
I don't know. It sets up so much very nicely.
And I think he'd written some fantasy books. I think he'd done a series set in Wales, so he already was kind of a series writer.
Series character.
Yeah. So
I think a couple, definitely.
Whether it was intentional or not, he definitely left himself lots of seeds to be able to grow a series if he wanted to, whether he'd made the decision or not. So.
Yeah, that was my feeling. You know, going back and looking at it, reading it after these years. The one other thing I would say, he really captures posh Edinburgh awfully well.
Yeah,
you know, this nice idea that you're behind closed doors, and he does that awful well because he comes from that background. He comes from, I don't mean him personally, but I mean the character comes from that background where so that's a different sort of detective, a detective from the upper echelons of Edinburgh society. You get loads of lawyers up there, but you don't really get a lot of on the ground policemen.
Yeah, I mean,
it's almost a modern take on the classic gentleman detective of the golden age, where where there's the gentleman detectives like Inspector Allen from Dame Nye Marsh and Lord Peter Wimsey and others, where they are from the upper classes, but they're almost kind of excluded from the upper classes because they're slumming it as a police officer instead of doing something else, you know, kind of thing.
There's a certain amount, I'm sure somebody asks him in this one, and asks Tony, that is, and I know once or twice in other ones that they basically, people do say to McLean, what the hell are you doing being cop? You don't need to do this. You have independent means, I think is the phrase. I mean, he drives an Alfa, for goodness sake. Doesn't, you know, bomb around in an old Fiesta or get the bus.
No.
But by the end, there's so much, as Jay mentioned, he's got so much tragedy in his early life. And then by the end of this book, he does kind of come into almost like an establishment sort of life on paper, but he just rejects all that and goes, no, I'm not, you know, what I want to do is catch bad guys, essentially, which is, you know, and we're back on the slightly maverick side, but not too maverick.
Yeah, fascinating character, and as we say, it was the beginning of a very powerful, long-running series. So excellent.
And the next
look forward.
Is,
I think, Louise, you said there's one out in February. Did you have a name for it, or?
It's called All That Lives.
All That Lives. Okay.
Yeah, I got my little Bloody Scotland bookmark.
Excellent.
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of readers out there are often looking for new series, and if you've read Ian Rankin and you've read Val McDermid and you've read Denise Miner and you're looking for another long-running Scottish crime series, this is really one you should give a go.
Yeah. Yep. Excellent. Okay, let's move on now to number 2 in our list tonight, The Cutting Room by Louise Welsh, and we have a short video of Louise. She's talking a bit in general in the lead up to the book. So
My name's Louise Welsh. I'm a writer. I'm a Scottish writer. I live in Glasgow. I'm now Professor of Creative Writing at the University of Glasgow, which is where we are today. And The Cutting Room was my very first book. It came out in 2002, and its main protagonist is an auctioneer called Rilke. And Rilke is a gay man, and in the course of his business, in the course of clearing a house in a posh part of the city, he comes across some really disturbing photographs. Yeah, it's a nasty book. It's always hard to know exactly where ideas come from. I think they come from lots of different places all at once. I was working as a second-hand bookseller when I started to write The Cutting Room, and so I guess that idea of what happens, the origin of things, where do they come from, and what happens if you find something that you're not happy with, what do you do about it, what are your responsibilities? Perhaps it came from that. I had a friend who told me about clearing the house of a very respectable gentleman who had died, and up in the attic he found all of this pornography, and nobody in the family was really very happy when he presented this to them. So I suppose that aspect of we all have some things hidden. Sometimes they're not dramatic things. Like a lot of Scottish writers, I'm interested in the Gothic, and that idea of what lies underneath is very much a part of Scottish Gothic. If you think of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Stevenson's masterpiece, or James Hogg's Justified Sinner. So I guess I was drawing on those influences. As a queer woman, I was also thinking about where queer people sit in society, and at that time in the 2000s when I was writing this book, we were seeing the campaign to keep Clause 28, which, for those who don't know, Clause 28 outlawed, let me get it right, the promotion of homosexuality. But what that meant was that people didn't teach about queer lives within schools. It meant that queer organisations wouldn't get funded. I think something like 75% of the population within Scotland agreed that it was wrong, according to surveys, to be gay at that point. So I guess all of this is encapsulated in this book to an extent, but it's also a very funny book.
Okay, I'm not sure I found it funny, but it wasn't a very funny book for me, but there were elements of wonderful dark humour. And what I would say, there were some lovely quotes from various newspapers about it at the time that I thought captured it beautifully. It was gleefully black, knowing first novel. That was from The Guardian, and effortlessly glides from a detective novel into literary fiction. So what did you think, Jane, about The Cutting Room?
Where to start with it, because there's so much to take in. I first read it probably very soon after it came out, and obviously I've had to re-familiarise myself with it recently, and there was so much I'd forgotten about it, and when I picked it up and read the first page, my first thought was, it's difficult subjects. We are looking at, and apologies to anybody that's offended, but, basically it's, snuff pictures. And that's, the crux of where Rilke, is it Rilke? I don't know how you pronounce his name. I say Rilke, but I'm probably wrong. Does everybody else have that pronunciation in their head, or is it something else?
I think that'll do fine, yeah.
It is a difficult subject, and she crams an awful lot in. We've got this quite bit of a creepy protagonist, but there's something about him that's compelling. He's emotionally isolated, he's tough, he likes a drink, he'll use his fists whenever he feels the need. And it gives him, there's a lot of depth to him, and there's a lot of layers. And if you're looking for a mystery, a typical mystery, this is not it, because he is not Columbo. He's not your typical detective. He seems to be stumbling. He comes across those pictures and he wants to know the background. He wants to know if they're staged, if he's, you know, looking at pictures of an actual murder taking place. And it takes him on quite a seedy journey, you know, and we find out that he's got questionable morals himself in terms of, you know, the way he carries out in his personal life. You know, he's promiscuous and he'll pick up strangers, you know, just for sex. But as I say, you know, and we get this journey into transvestites clubs and bars and, you know, porn shops, and, you know, we're coming to a world that you might not be familiar with. And then she, even though the novel was written 20 years ago, it's very, very relevant now, because we've got, you know, the speeches about the way women are treated, especially, you know, when it comes to human trafficking in Eastern European women, and the way the failures on, you know, law enforcement and governments to tackle it, and how to stop, you know, women being trafficked into a sex trade. And you've got lots of speeches in the book where, you know, there's a lot of prose is, you know, going straight into that subject. So for me, it is a crime book, it's a mystery book, but it's not a typical detective. He's not very good, and we're going along with him to solve this mystery, but it ends up, you know, he doesn't solve it as any other detective would. You know, here's who did it. It's more of a journey, and we get a lot of Glasgow, which is quite Gothic and Victorian almost in its descriptions. So yeah, no, it was good. It was a good book, and you know, even though it was written 20 years ago, it's still very relevant today.
Yeah, I agree.
Totally agree.
Yeah, Louise, do you want to come in and give us what you think?
Just Jane saying about everything is still relevant now. What struck me, I read it at the beginning of the year. I had never read it before, and oh my God, what an idiot, because it's amazing. So rereading it, I found we go through Rilke's investigation isn't quite the right word, but it'll have to do. He's looking into these photographs, and we get all these wonderful like little character vignettes and little scenes, like in the club, and he goes to the pawn shop, he goes to the secondhand bookshop, all of these things, and you sit going, well, these are wonderful, this is a wonderful book, but he's not getting anywhere. But if you look at it again, you realize that he's not getting anywhere with the thing that happened 60 years ago. But these people are still here now, or the same type of people, and now being 2002. And he's talking to these same kind of people. These things are still going on, which you do discover these things are still going on. And as Jane said, they are still going on 20 years later. It's got so much to say about that now, that it's like Louise was looking into a crystal ball, or possibly just that haven't moved on very much. I'm not quite sure. But I love that. I love the way that she kind of just shows you one thing, but actually is doing another. It's quite an interesting like sleight of hand, and all the little things she drops in about Rilke and his background, and I hadn't picked up at all because I was too busy the first time around. I was just too busy turning the pages and going, oh my God. But then there's all these little things that are dropped in. The fact that he keeps a revolver under his bed, and it's just there. It's just dropped in a moment of, well, wait a minute, hang on. He's just the most fascinating character.
Did you like him?
It's interesting. I would just say before we go on to Craig here, first of all, I just thought the descriptions of people and of the city of Glasgow were just astonishing. And I had forgotten, because, you know, I read it when it first came out, and I hadn't read it since. And it was almost like reading another book. And that's the wonderful thing about books. You go back later and you realize you went through it and you miss things. Just like you were saying, you know, you get so caught up in turning the pages, and you enter it again and you find all these other wonderful things about it in the book. I felt that very strongly, but I agree it's as valid today as it was 20 years ago, because it's not changed. We might have changed our terminology slightly in our reference to different types of people, but yeah, it's still the same things are happening. Fascinating. Craig, I mean, obviously you're not, weren't born and brought up in Glasgow, weren't born and brought up in Scotland or Edinburgh, so you're looking at it as we might read a book set in New Zealand. So I know you're in London now. Yeah.
No, and it's very true. I'm coming at it from a different perspective, is that even though I'm more familiar now with Glasgow or Edinburgh than I was when the book came out, having not been there at the time the book came out, I'm still much more of an outsider and stuff in terms of a reader. What could you say about this? I think the easiest thing to say is we could spend the entire hour tonight talking about this book and we would not get through everything you could talk about this book. This is a stone cold classic of modern British crime writing. And I'm just going to say British, not Scottish. This is a stone cold classic of modern British crime writing. It is a wonderful book. It's astonishing. It was a debut. It's astonishing. It's so assured. I know that it won a couple of awards. It won the Dagger and it won, I think, the Saltire Prize and some others as well. It's more of a literary award. And you're just like, yeah, of course it did. It's the writing is so wonderful. The themes and the events in the book are very confronting. They're very confronting now, let alone 20 years ago when it was written. And as Louise said in her video, it was a different time then. And you hope that we've moved on in some ways when it comes to LGBT plus people and things like that, but obviously haven't moved on in other ways. But, it's still a confronting book to read now. And so it was so far ahead of its time in a way back then. I don't think, obviously Val and others had queer characters in their books at the time, but the way that Louise does it and the places she takes you and how far she takes you with some of the characters, and that is, it's really wonderful and it's compelling and confronting, but it's written so beautifully that you're just pulled through it and you're dealing with these confronting images and these confronting scenes and these confronting acts and these confronting themes, but you just cannot stop reading. And I think either Louise or Jane said about the little character vignettes and the little setting vignettes, and there's just so many, and all of them, it's just masterful. I mean, I think there's a quote on the back of my copy from the Times, which I imagine was at the time or shortly after. Astonishing first novel, catapulted Welsh straight into the superstar league. And yeah, I mean, I write for newspapers and magazines and we try and say good things, but I think 20 years later, that stands up. This is a superstar book. This is a superstar debut. I mean, the very first sentence, I think just kind of encapsulates it. Never expect anything. It's the title of the first chapter and the first 3 words of the book. And so much of it's about that. It's about the unexpected. It's about what we don't see. It's about what lies below the surface. I was having a conversation with someone 2 or 3 years ago about themes that we would like to see explored more in crime fiction, because I'm firmly of the school that believes that crime fiction can hold up a mirror to society, that crime fiction is the modern social novel, as Ian Rankin and Val and Dennis Lehane and others have said, that it is crime fiction, and particularly speaking from the outside. I was writing about this 10 years ago, about Scottish crime writing when I was living in New Zealand, that Scottish crime writing, more than the literary fiction of Britain, was the thing that was actually showing modern Britain and modern Scotland, with devolution, with various things going on with immigration, with gangs and everything else. And Scottish crime writing has always been exceptionally good at that. And I think Louise's book is a marvelous example of that. But one of the things that I was speaking to with this author was about the themes that we would like to see explored in crime writing that we have been, because there's so much of it, but haven't been explored a lot. And one of those was human trafficking and things like that. And there are crime novels out there that explore that. But I mean, Louise was basically dealing with this 20 years ago and things. And it's still something that probably we need more books about and we need more notice about. And there's a little passage, I hope you don't mind if I read it. Because when I was reading it again yesterday, and I think it kind of sums up a little bit about the book without being, it's near the end, but it's not a spoiler because it's more about the theme. But it says, the war against drugs is highly funded, highly publicized, but rape, abduction, even possible murder of the poor and the dispossessed, young woman promised good jobs abroad, children found on the street, runaways out to teach mum and dad a lesson, there never seems to be enough money to fight that. And it was so true. Terrorism, drugs, we throw so much at, But this is a massive scourge that's going on, again, behind the scenes, behind closed doors, down the dark alleyways, the places so many of us don't look and like to believe don't exist or don't exist as so much they do. And Louise has just plunged us into that, along with antiques and secondhand books and vintage stuff and this class society and just these wonderful, wonderful characters. Cannot recommend this highly enough.
Well said. I think we all agree with you on that. Yeah.
Yep.
And now our final book, and can't believe they're all fantastic. But
Such a great trio. Such a great trio.
I know, such a treat. But I'm glad I sort of wanted to keep this one to the end because, again, this is a debut, but it is the only book that this man has yet written, I believe. And it's Winter Counts. I love the title, I love the cover, and I love the book, by David Heska Wanbli Weiden. And here's a short video of David reading from his book.
Hello, I'm David Heska Wanbli Weiden, and I'm just tremendously honored that Winter Counts has been chosen as the selection of the Bloody Scotland Book Club. So I am here today just to read a few pages from chapter 4 of Winter Counts. So in this very short scene, Virgil Wounded Horse, the hero of Winter Counts, is checking on his 14-year-old nephew, Nathan. So here is a very short excerpt from chapter 4 of Winter Counts. I'd had enough for the night, so I went to go and check on Nathan. I could see that his lights were on, so I'd turn everything off and cover him with a blanket. I opened the door and saw that he was passed out on his bed, all of his clothes still on, his arm hanging down at his side. Dude, why don't you get into your shorts and get under the covers? He didn't respond. Nathan, let's go to bed. I'm tired. Still no response. Nathan? I looked at him closely. His face and his lips were gray, almost blue. I saw an empty balloon, a lighter, and some crumpled, burned foil on the floor. There was an acrid vinegar odor in the air. Oh no. Nathan, wake up. Get up. I tried to sit him up, but he was too heavy and he fell back onto the bed. I pulled his eyelids up. His pupils were tiny and dark, like miniature black holes, and his skin felt cold and clammy. I slapped his face hard. Nathan, open your eyes, wake up. No response, but I saw his chin move just a little. I ran to the living room for my cell phone. The IHS hospital was 50 miles from here, and the tribal police station about 20. The tribal cops were my only hope. My hands shaking, I dialed the number. Police. This is Virgil Wounded Horse, my nephew. He's overdosing. He won't wake up. You need to send, what is your address? Please hurry, he's unconscious. I need your address, sir. He sounded pissed off, like I was stopping him from going home after a long shift. 83 in Spidergrass Road. We're the only house out here. Stay on the phone with me, all right? Is he breathing? I think so, yeah, but not much. Just stay on the phone. Stay on the phone, all right? Just hurry. How old is he? I don't know. He's 14. He's only 14. I flashed back to Nathan as a little kid, playing with some toy cars I'd given him. What difference did it make how old he was if he was overdosing? How long has he been down? I don't know. I just found him. Do you have a car free? The dispatcher sounded angry again. We're on the way. You said it was an overdose? Heroin, I think. There was a balloon and some foil on the floor. How do you know how much of the drug he took? How the fuck should I know? I didn't know he was doing that shit. Just trying to help. How much does he weigh? I don't know, maybe 140. We'll be there soon. Just stay with me, okay? Can you stay on the line? Sir? I let the phone drop to the floor. Black clouds entered the room, taking up all the oxygen, all of the air. I couldn't breathe, so I let the darkness envelop my lungs, my skin, my body. Thank you. And again, I really, really hope you enjoy reading Winter Counts. This is David Heska Wanbli Weiden speaking to you today from Denver, Colorado, USA.
Wow. I remember being horrifically shocked by that particular bit of the book, but yeah, to hear it being read by the authors is quite spectacular. I'm going to pass now to Craig, because I know you've interviewed David and you've got quite a lot of background knowledge from him already about the book.
Yeah,
so tell us about it.
I was fortunate enough. I actually chaired a session at this year's Bloody Scotland where David beamed in from Denver, Colorado, alongside some other authors from around the world. And I've also been able to interview David a couple of times one-on-one for kind of hour-long interviews. And as you can see, he's a fascinating, articulate guy. He's got a lot to say. He's a professor of Native American Studies at a university in Denver, Colorado. He actually grew up in Denver, but he's Lakota himself. So the Rosebud Reservation that's in the book is his home reservation in South Dakota, though he was born in Denver to a mother who was born from the reservation. So the character of Virgil Wounded Horse is really fascinating because he's a vigilante on the reservation. And this is something that is true to life. These type of people do exist. They're not highly publicized, but they do exist. And the reason that they exist, as David explains in the book, is that the criminal justice system in the US is a mess. And it is even more of a mess when it comes to Indigenous people. And the way that the reservations work is that a whole lot of crimes that happen there, the tribal police can only do the low-level crimes. If it's anything serious, rape, murder, etc., then the FBI, as the federal kind of cops, have to come in and do it. The problem is that the FBI, whether because of funding and many other things, choose to kind of basically not prosecute a whole lot of cases. So a whole lot of child molesters and rapists and others are never brought to justice, whether they're white people doing those things on the reservation or kind of natives doing them themselves as well. So there's a huge justice gap, and we could talk about this for a long time, so I won't go into it today. But this is why people such as Virgil exist. And Virgil's the kind of person who the families of a kid who's been raped or someone who's been hooked on drugs by the local drug dealer kind of call Virgil, and he takes a fee for every bone that he breaks or every tooth that he knocks out and tries to teach people a bit of a primitive lesson. In this book, his nephew Nathan is the part that David read out, gets caught up in drugs coming in the reservation, and Virgil decides to investigate this, which takes him to a whole lot of places, including confronting his own identity and who he is. And there's so many layers in this book. I could talk a long time, and I want to give Louise and Jane a good amount of time to talk about it. But there's a whole lot about the broken criminal justice system. There's a whole lot about Native identity. Virgil, like David himself, is what they call an Iesca. And an Iesca is basically, it's a slur. It actually means speaks white, but it's a slur for half-breed, and that, you know, you're not fully native. And like David has a native mother and a white father, and Virgil in the story is the same. So you're immediately that insider-outsider character, is that you kind of don't fit into either world. So Virgil, and David's obviously expressing some of that through himself. There's a whole lot. It's beautifully written. There's some really exciting action-packed scenes, but there's also a lot of really interesting themes, which are true to life, things that many people may not understand about how reservations work. He takes us onto the reservation. It's a compelling crime story. It's beautifully written. This was actually recommended to me 2 years ago, or a year and a bit ago, at Bloody Scotland 2020, by Sean Cosby, who wrote Razorblade Tears and Blacktop Wasteland, which are two magnificent books that have come out during the pandemic. I told Sean how much I was chairing Sean in an online panel, and I told him how much I like Blacktop Wasteland. He says, if you like my book, read Winter Counts. It wasn't out in the UK at the time. I ordered it especially from the US on Sean's recommendation. He was absolutely right. It was my second favorite read of 2020 behind Winter Counts behind Blacktop Wasteland. They were my two favorite reads, and now it's out in the UK and I can rave to it about everyone. I kind of haven't been able to rave about it for a year because it wasn't really out here or in Australia or New Zealand. So it's just a really, really brilliant book. I would highly recommend it to everyone, and there's so much you could talk about, but I'll let Louise and Jane do that. So.
Yeah, I'm just going to bum up Bloody Scotland now and say, of course, it didn't come out to the 30th of September, but we had him at Bloody Scotland. So we're always trying to be ahead. of the
Yeah,
game.
and they had some preview copies there, and they were sold out like that with the audience.
Yeah, well, they would have. They definitely would have. Wonderful book. Jane, I'm going to come to you. What I know, I saw we email by you that you just fell in love with this book.
Oh, Matt, what can I say about this book? Craig, thank you so much for recommending it for the book club this month, because in all honesty, it's not something, the cover would have attracted me because the cover is just stunning, but I probably wouldn't have picked it up to read the back of it. And I just, oh, my heart, it's actually it's shot straight into my top 3 of 2021. It is just, for me, it's beyond any of my own personal experiences. I've got no, I know nothing about Native American life. I know nothing about the struggle. The plot of the drugs and Virgil being this vigilante type enforcer was almost a subplot for me, because we were learning more about him, the culture, the rituals, the heartbreaking history, the grinding poverty, and it was a real eye-opener, and it felt like a journey, an educational journey, as well as this fantastic plot. And it's a bloody good read, honestly. It is just, I read it in about 12 hours. I just soaked it up. I couldn't believe it, and I just want more of Virgil, and I hope that we're getting it. I can't wait for the next one.
I think you quite liked it then, Jean.
Loved it, honestly.
Isn't it wonderful
when
when
you've not read it, get out there.
Yeah, it's wonderful when you find a book like that. Louise.
Yeah, again, thank you, Craig, who I keep seeing him talk about it and thinking, yeah, I must get around to that, And normally I get around to things like, I don't know, 5 years' time. So I'm really pleased that I was made to read this. It's awesome. Things that really struck me, like Jane's talking about all the issues there. I don't know, again, I know nothing about Native American life, really. And you learn so much in this. But there is also, while it's very specific, I mean, like, so specific to these people in this place, it's also incredibly universal. Yeah, so you've got the struggle for justice to get anything. You've got a community that's being pretty much ignored by the outside world. You've got all these people who are being mistreated, either in terms of being ignored, in terms of literally being mistreated. At the beginning is Virgil goes after a guy who's raped a schoolgirl. These people are just having this horrendous life, and yet there is a universality of experience there. I'm a working class rural woman from the north of England. I kind of have a small insight to what it's like to be a community that's being ignored by your government. And that sounds quite trite, but you get so much out of it that is, you don't need to have lived that life to understand it and have it. And if you don't have empathy with these people, go and look at yourself in the mirror, because it demands that kind of thing. It's just so powerful in that respect. And the other thing that got me, and I kind of hummed and hawed about mentioning it, the idea of vigilante justice is a huge recurring theme right through all kinds of crime fiction. Because you can't get what you can't get a person on trial, or you can't take them to court, whatever. And, do you want to do something around the edges? Well, this guy does that. And it reminded me terribly of watching Western movies with my dad on a Sunday afternoon, because that's a lot of that. That's a lot of some guys get together and there is no justice because it's a frontier, and they go out and dole their vigilante justice out on the other guy, and who was normally Native American, feathers and all. And I just think the way that was at the back of my head when I was reading this just made it even more powerful. And like Jane said, just for God's sake, just get a copy of this if you haven't read it. It's really stunning. You will learn a lot, and you will be entertained, and you will be heartbroken all the way through it as well. It's just stunning.
Yeah, I mean, the book had sorry, I was just kidding.
No, it's fine. No, go ahead.
Book had won nine awards in America before it was published in the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. It didn't quite sweep, but it kind of semi-swept most of the major crime writing awards for best first novel, plus some other kind of literary or regional awards for kind of the part of the world it came from. There's a question from Bridget Linton, and Jane kind of brought it up as well, just saying that they hope this is the first of the series. I can confirm, having recently interviewed David since Bloody Scotland as well, that he is working on a second book in the series, and he intends it to go beyond that. But the second one delves into some other issues facing Native American people as well. Obviously, the criminal justice things are ongoing, but there are other issues he's looking into in terms of the suppression of their religion and stuff over the years, and other stuff as well. That'll probably be out in a couple of years. And but he does have a couple of short stories out, including some Virgil Wounded Health short stories. I think the Midnight Hour anthology that's just come out, Denver Noir, and a couple of other anthologies. So if you want to get a little bit more Virgil, there will be a couple of short stories coming out either now or in the coming months, kind of before having to wait for the book. But yeah, I would highly recommend it. Just an astonishing writer, and it's just one of those ones where you're like, thanks for joining us. Come to the crime book. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that the whole business of their spirituality and his move, you know, as you said, he was somebody who was half and half, and or they regarded them as that, and he really just dispensed with the whole idea of spirituality of his tribe. And yet the bits that were described were so moving. It was like they were like the ecological people of this century, the people who lived and on the land and didn't take too much from the land, just took what they needed. And I thought some of that bit, I can't remember the old man's name, the sort of tribal leader, I thought those scenes were fascinating between the main character and this old man, and the need for them to work as a community to solve the problem. Yeah, I thought they were very powerful. Whereas in the other two books, what we had obviously was this supernatural, slight supernatural thing in James's book, which was essentially bad. The supernatural spiritual aspect was bad. And the kind of seedy underworld of the cutting room, that way of thinking wasn't nice either. And yet within this book, there was this sense of some goodness despite all the darkness. Right, I think we're growing almost to the end of this particular event, according to my my timing. So I'm going to pass over now to our host for December, which is Craig Robertson.
And thank you. I want to cut the end of that, but it sounded an absolutely fascinating discussion. I want to cut the end because I completely forgot that I was going to come on and talk about December's books. I remembered all of 2 minutes ago. So this might not be quite as well. There you go. That's going to be a handy reminder for me as much as for anyone else. We're going to have a bit of a wintry theme, rightly, I think, for December. Maybe not festive cheer, but definitely a wintry. We have Cold as Hell, which is the new book from Livia Sigurdardóttir. We have Jo Nesbo's The Snowman and Stuart McBride's Chilling Cold Granite. So it'll be ho, ho, ho all the way around in December. Festive cheer for all. I read one of the three, and I'm looking forward to reading the other two. And I hope we have as much fun reading them. I'm sure we will, as you guys had tonight.
Thank you. Right, I think that's us drawing to a close now. Can I just thank my panelists for reading the books with me and having such a great response. I think we all thoroughly enjoyed them, and we recommend all three to everyone out there. And anybody out there, thank you for coming and listening to us. And remember, it will go up on the YouTube channel if you weren't able to join us tonight. Okay, that's bye-bye then from Bloody Scotland Book Club.